The Millionaire's quadruplets had run off every nanny they'd ever had, until she arrived and managed the impossible. The Edinburgh rain, a silvery drizzle, fell like thin threads through a thick curtain of grey fog. Just on the outskirts of the city, high on a hill, stood the Langford mansion, resembling a lonely fortress. Its cold stone walls, tall windows, and the faint lights flickering within hinted at the sadness inside. It had once been a symbol of joy, but now it was simply a prison for 4 grieving little boys. Edward Langford, 38, the founder of Langford Systems, was known as the brilliant mind behind New Britain. He possessed everything a man could want: wealth, influence, prestige, everything except peace in his own home. After the death of his beloved wife Emily, who died giving birth to their quadruplet sons, Edward's world had been shattered. Half of him remained forever in that delivery room, frozen in time. His sons, Oliver, Ethan, Liam, and Noah, were 5 years old and acted like 4 reflections of the same storm. They didn't cry, and they never spoke about their mother. They just destroyed things, screamed, and refused to obey. In 5 months, 18 nannies had fled the mansion. Some left in tears, others shouting in anger, and a few didn't even bother to collect their belongings. The house that had once echoed with Emily's piano music now vibrated with the sound of shattering glass and the children's uncontrollable rage. That morning, the storm outside was just a faint echo of the turmoil inside. The living room looked like a battlefield, with broken furniture and splattered paint everywhere. The grandfather clock had stopped ticking the night before, as if it too had surrendered. Edward stood amidst the chaos, his shirt wrinkled and a cold cup of coffee in his hand. Looking at his reflection in the window, he saw not a tech tycoon, but a grieving widower slowly losing himself. He'd tried everything: nannies, therapists, child psychologists, but all had been defeated. His sons had transformed the house into a war zone. Oliver, the commander; Ethan, the trap-maker; Liam, the destroyer; and Noah, who whispered to their mommy, Emily, in the mirror. The butler entered the room, sighing heavily. "Sir, the 18th nanny has just resigned." Edward didn't react. He simply nodded, his eyes hollow. Deep down, he knew that nobody could penetrate the wall of grief that surrounded his children. Nobody, that is, until that day. A knock echoed through the rain-soaked silence. 3 knocks. Steady, deliberate. The butler frowned and went to the door. Standing beneath the dim porch light was a woman with silver hair, a worn wool coat, and a scuffed leather suitcase. A cold gust of wind blew in, sending strands of her hair across her face. But her eyes remained calm, deep, and unwavering. Her name was Grace Morgan, and she was about to step into a house where the storm never seemed to end. The door opened, and a gust of cold wind swept in, carrying the scent of damp earth and rain. The woman standing there, Grace Morgan, looked nothing like any nanny who had ever crossed the threshold of the Langford home. She wore no crisp uniform, flashed no polished smile. Instead, she was dressed in a faded grey wool coat, worn shoes, and carried a leather suitcase tied together with string. The butler, Mr. Henderson, frowned with suspicion. "Madam, this household does not hire people outside of agencies. Perhaps you've come to the wrong address." Grace smiled gently, a smile that seemed to bring a strange light into the dim hallway. "No mistake, Mr. Henderson. I'm here to see Mr. Langford." Her voice was neither loud nor soft, but simply steady. In a house where everyone seemed to shout, her calm tone felt like a breath of fresh air seeping through cracks in a storm. Edward came down the staircase, buttoning his coat as he prepared to leave for another meeting. When his eyes met Grace's, he froze. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. She stood there as still and calm as if nothing in this house could frighten her. Behind her, the four boys appeared, as if summoned by the wind. Oliver, the leader, crossed his arms, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Ethan hid a toy hammer behind his back. Liam grinned mischievously. Noah, the quiet one, hovered at the back, half hidden in the shadows. Grace knelt down, bringing her eyes to their level. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask any questions. She simply said, slowly and gently, "I know what it feels like to lose the person who made your world make sense." The boys froze. Even the rain outside seemed to quiet. Noah was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "You lost someone too." Grace nodded, her eyes shimmering with a gentle sadness. "Yes, but I learned that sometimes the ones who left us wouldn't want our home to become a place where laughter dies." Silence descended. Oliver's arms fell to his sides. Ethan dropped the toy hammer. Liam looked down at his feet. Noah stared at her as if he had finally found someone who understood the language of his silence. From the staircase, Edward felt something stir within him. For 6 months, the house had known only tears and shouting. But now, for the first time, there was silence, not born of fear, but of listening. Grace stood up, brushed off her knees, and said, "I'm not here to command or control. I'm here to understand. If you'll allow me, I'd like to stay for a few days. No pay, no contract, just to see if I can help this house breathe again." Edward looked at her for a long moment. In her eyes he saw no pity, no ambition, only understanding. He nodded quietly. "You have 3 days." Grace smiled and bowed slightly. Behind her, the 4 boys watched silently. The rain continued to fall, but inside the house, where the storm had never stopped, a small warmth had begun to rise. Grace's first day in the Langford home passed amidst wary glances and whispers behind her back. She didn't force conversation, didn't give orders, didn't set rules. She simply observed, quietly, patiently, as if listening to the heartbeat of a wounded home. She realized that each child had their own way of grieving, even without tears. Oliver, the eldest, was the commander. He drew attack plans and gave orders to his siblings like a tiny general. But whenever Grace came near, he hid the maps under the table and tried to appear indifferent. She saw in his eyes a fear of losing control, a child trying to hold his family together by controlling it, afraid that if he let go, everything would fall apart again. Ethan, the second boy, spent hours assembling complex toys. He used Lego pieces and bits of wire to build traps and unstable systems, just to watch them work. Grace never destroyed his creations. She simply watched his small hands tremble as he connected the final wire. She understood that this wasn't just a game. It was his way of reclaiming control in a world that had cruelly taken his mother from him. Liam was the real storm. His hands broke anything within reach. When Grace gently asked, "Why did you break this vase?" he answered bluntly, "Because it was going to break anyway. Everything breaks sooner or later." Grace didn't scold him. She simply picked up the shards and said softly, "And when something breaks, sometimes we can still put it back together, can't we?" For the first time, Liam didn't respond with a scream. He just looked at her, silent. Noah, the youngest, was different. He spoke little and often sat alone before a mirror, whispering. The others called it talking to ghosts. Grace didn't interfere. She simply sat beside him, gazing into the old mirror. "Who are you talking to, Noah?" "Mommy. She doesn't like this house being so dark." Grace nodded gently. "Then we'll light it up so she can see that you're still smiling. Okay?" Noah didn't reply, but his tiny hand quietly reached for hers. That night, when the children were asleep, Grace sat in the dim living room and wrote everything down in an old leather notebook. "Each child carries a wound," she wrote. "They don't need discipline. They need to be seen. Every act of misbehavior is a cry that adults have failed to hear." Upstairs, Edward sat in his office, the glow of the computer screen reflecting his tired face. He replayed the security footage. Grace walking through the hallway, gently picking up broken pieces, straightening a tilted family photo. No words, no judgment, just a touch with silent respect. He turned off the screen, leaned back, and exhaled. For the first time, a thought flickered in his mind. Maybe what the children needed wasn't a nanny, but someone brave enough to see their sorrow. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside the Langford house, the first drops of healing had already begun to fall. On the second day, the children decided to test whether Grace Morgan was truly as fearless as her calm demeanor suggested. Oliver led the charge, sketching out a plan in his little strategy notebook, his voice serious as a young officer. Operation: Unexpected Rain. Objective: Make her run away before lunch. The other three nodded eagerly. Ethan prepared a bucket of water. Liam scattered marbles across the hallway. And Noah, though reluctant, hung a plastic spider over the living room doorway. The morning passed in an oddly tense silence. When Grace walked by, the children held their breath, their eyes glinting with mischief. And then, splash. The bucket of water came crashing down over her head. The icy shock soaked her hair, but instead of screaming, Grace burst out laughing. Her laughter rang through the house, clear, warm, and unexpected, freezing the children in place. "Oh my, it's really raining indoors," she said, half amused, half playful. She stepped forward, her foot landing squarely on the marbles. Instead of falling, she twirled gracefully like a dancer and gave a little bow to her stunned audience at the end of the hallway. Oliver's eyes widened. Ethan forgot to laugh. Liam gasped, "Whoa!" in pure awe. And Noah, for the first time since his mother's death, his eyes sparkled with light. When Grace entered the living room, she saw the plastic spider dangling from the doorframe. She gently took it down, placed it in her palm, and said softly, almost in a whisper, "You know, even the creatures we fear the most, sometimes they're just looking for a safe place." Then she set the little spider on the bookshelf right beside an old photo of Emily. It was a small gesture, but it reached the deepest corners of the children's hearts. That afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. No shouting, no running, no crashing sounds. Grace changed out of her wet clothes, brewed a pot of tea, and sat by the fireplace, reading as if the morning's chaos had never happened. That night, as the 4 children peeked down the stairs, Oliver whispered, "Why isn't she angry?" Noah replied softly, "Maybe because she understands." Later, they tiptoed into Grace's room, carrying the empty bucket, returning the spoils of war. Grace smiled and took it from them without a word. Good night, my 4 little conspirators. Good night, Mrs. Noah hesitated, then finished quietly. Grace. For the first time, the Langford house went dark in effortless peace. No one realized it yet, but that morning had marked the very moment the house had begun to laugh again. The next morning, the smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the Langford house, a scent that hadn't been present since Emily's passing. Every morning since then, breakfast had been served by the private chef in heavy silence. But that day, the children woke up to a strange, comforting aroma and the soft sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. Grace stood there, wearing a small floral apron, her hands rolling dough on the wooden counter. It wasn't the fine white flour delivered from the fancy bakery. It was the ordinary kind, uneven in texture, with a bit of it dusted across her cheek. When Oliver, the first to peek in, asked, "What are you doing?" Grace didn't look up. She simply smiled. Bread. The other 3 boys appeared right after, curious. She didn't ask them to help, just continued her work, as if knowing that curiosity was the first step toward connection. 5 minutes later, Ethan couldn't resist any longer. He pulled up a chair beside her. "Can I roll the dough?" "Of course," she said, "but each of you must make your own kind." She divided the dough into 4 parts, placed one before each child, and spoke in a tone both gentle and serious, as if giving them an important mission. "Oliver, you'll make the crusty bread. A leader must know when to use strength and when to wait. Ethan, you'll make the sweet bread. Everything you touch is precise, but sometimes a bit of spontaneity creates the real flavor. Liam, you'll make the dense loaf. Punch the dough hard if you must, but remember, not everything strong needs to be broken. Noah, you'll make the fruit-filled roll. Hide the sweetness inside where others can't see it." The 4 boys got to work, at first clumsy, then gradually absorbed. The kitchen, once a forbidden zone, filled with voices, laughter, the scent of melting butter, and the sound of hands working dough. When the first batch came out of the oven, Grace didn't grade them. She simply looked at each loaf with quiet reverence. "None of these are more perfect than the others," she said softly, "because perfection isn't about how alike they are. It's about the story each one carries." For the first time, lunchtime in that house wasn't a battlefield. The 4 boys laughed and argued about whose bread tasted the best, then burst into giggles when they caught Noah sneaking extra honey into his. Edward came home halfway through the day, planning only to grab some files, but as he stepped into the kitchen, he froze. His 4 sons were sitting around a table with a woman he barely knew, and they were laughing. The sight, so simple, tightened his chest in a way he couldn't explain. Grace looked up, smiled, and handed him a small piece of bread. "Try it," she said. "Don't ask what kind it is. Guess who made it?" Edward took a bite. Sweet and salty, crisp outside, soft inside. "This one? Oliver's?" "No," Grace laughed. "Liam's. He's the strongest boy, with hands that tremble the most when kneading dough." Edward looked at her, and for reasons he couldn't name, warmth began to spread through him. For 6 months he had lived in silence, and now the smallest sound, a child's laugh, made him want to stay just a little longer. He spoke first. "Mrs. Morgan." Grace looked up. The light of the setting sun streamed through her silver hair, softening her face in a way that made her look almost radiant. "Yes, Mr. Langford?" He was silent for a few seconds, as if searching for the right words. "How long have you been here now?" "Exactly 3 days, sir." He took a few steps closer, his hands in his pockets, his eyes still fixed on the children playing nearby. "I don't know what you've done to them," he said quietly, "but for the past 6 months I hadn't heard that kind of laughter." Grace only smiled gently. "I didn't do anything. I just let them be themselves." Edward turned to her then, his voice lower, more sincere than ever. "You said you didn't want a contract or a salary." He hesitated, the words heavy on his tongue. "But what if I said, I don't want another employee. I want someone who stays. Not because she must, but because this house finally feels alive with her in it." Grace froze slightly, her hand pausing mid-stitch. "Stay?" "Yes," he said, his voice even lower. "Officially, as the one who keeps this family breathing." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening but bright. "All right, Mr. Langford. I'll stay, but only on one condition." "What is it?" "Don't call me Mrs. Morgan. Call me Grace. Here, I'm not staff. I'm part of this home." He nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "Then, welcome home, Grace." In that instant, the evening breeze drifted through the open window, carrying with it the scent of dough, of tea, and the quiet warmth of a new beginning. From the day Grace officially stayed, the Langford house seemed to breathe to a different rhythm. No more heavy mornings, no more doors slammed shut in silence. The children learned to set the table, to pour milk for each other, and sometimes to sit quietly reading beside Grace without being told to. Even Edward, who used to come home only to sleep, began lingering a little longer in the living room before leaving for work. But peace always arrives hand in hand with a test. One morning, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the gallery room. When Grace rushed in, she saw it. The antique porcelain vase Edward once called irreplaceable, now scattered into hundreds of pieces. The 4 boys stood side by side, silent. Oliver's fists were clenched. Liam's head hung low. Grace looked at the scene, then at the children. She didn't shout, didn't scold. Her voice was as soft as a breath. "Is anyone hurt?" No one answered. Only guilty eyes flickered toward the floor. This vase was precious because it was old and rare, but what made it truly valuable was the time and the heart of the one who created it. The children stayed quiet. Then Oliver whispered, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grace. We just wanted to see how strong it really was." Grace nodded gently without blame. "Tomorrow we'll go see something together, not as punishment, but to learn what true beauty means." The next day, Glasgow was cold and heavy with fog. Grace took the boys to a small pottery workshop by the River Clyde. An old craftsman greeted them with a bow, his hands covered in clay, his smile kind and patient. "Are you going to teach us how to make pottery?" Ethan asked. "No," Grace smiled. "Today we'll only watch. Just look. Do nothing else." For 8 long hours, the children sat around the spinning wheel. The craftsman shaped a lump of lifeless clay, turning, trimming, fixing, only to start over again each time it tilted or collapsed. Liam grew restless. "Why don't you just throw it away and make a new one?" The old man chuckled. "Because if I give up, I'll never know if it could have become something beautiful." Noah, sitting in Grace's lap, whispered, "Grace, a vase is like a person, isn't it?" Grace nodded softly. "Yes, fragile, but when loved, it can stand strong." When the vase was finally complete, the 4 boys clapped. The craftsman placed it carefully into the kiln and said, "This is the hardest part. The fire will test whether it's strong enough to survive." Grace turned to the boys. "And sometimes pain is that fire. It doesn't come to destroy us, but to shape us into something more beautiful." That evening they returned home. The house glowed warmly with light. The children said nothing. They simply began gathering the broken shards of the old vase. Ethan arranged them carefully. Oliver brought glue. Liam held Noah's hand to keep him from getting hurt. The 4 of them sat together, patiently piecing the fragments one by one. When Edward walked in, he froze. Before him stood the once broken vase, clumsily mended yet full of love, its cracks glowing softly under the golden light. "My boys," Edward's voice caught. "Why?" Oliver replied. "Because something broken can still be beautiful if we try." Edward looked at the vase, then at Grace. And in that moment, he understood that this wasn't just a lesson for the children, but for himself. Emily's death had shattered him, but perhaps he too could learn how to piece himself back together. That night, when the children were asleep, Edward passed by the living room and saw the warm glow of a lamp spilling through the doorway. Grace was sitting there, a cup of cold tea on the table, her eyes distant, as if she was speaking to someone only she could see. He stepped inside, his voice gentle. "You're still awake?" Grace startled slightly, then smiled. "I don't sleep much. There are nights when memories refuse to let you rest." Edward sat down across from her. After a few moments of silence, he said quietly, "Grace, I've always felt that you understand my pain better than anyone. Why is that?" She looked at him, her gaze soft, conflicted, as though deciding whether to keep something hidden or finally release it. At last she spoke in a trembling whisper, "Because I've lived with that same pain." He said nothing, just waited. For a long moment, only the sound of the fire filled the room, soft, alive, almost like a heartbeat. And then Grace's secret began to unfold, slowly, painfully, like fog dissolving under the first light of dawn. 28 years ago," she began, "I gave birth to 4 boys, quadruplets, just like your sons." "Quadruplets?" Edward repeated, barely believing his ears. "Yes, 4 little ones, Daniel, Michael, Peter, and John. They were my whole world." A faint smile crossed her lips, though it quivered at the edges. "Their father left before they were even born. I raised all 4 alone. Life was hard, but I never felt tired." Her voice grew thin, fragile as thread. 6 years ago, on my 50th birthday, they threw me a surprise party. Afterward, they insisted on driving home together in one car, like when they were kids, and then... Edward's voice cracked. A truck lost control. None of them survived. The room fell silent. The lamp flickered softly in the draught. "I buried 4 white coffins," she whispered, "in one day." Edward couldn't speak. Tears slid down his face. He wasn't even sure for whom they fell. For her, for himself, or for the souls that were gone. Grace continued, her voice trembling but steady. "I tried to die 3 times, but I failed each time. I thought maybe God was mocking me, until one night I saw you on television talking about the fear of losing your child. the helplessness of a father who no longer knew how to reach his children's hearts. "That night," she said with a faint, tearful smile, "I understood why I was still alive. I knew I had to come here." Edward buried his face in his hands. "Grace, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," she replied softly. "I didn't come here to save anyone. I came to live again, because when we save someone, sometimes we are the ones who are saved." She paused, looking at him deeply before adding, "I saw in your children the same anger I once saw in my own, the anger of children who lost their mother. I knew only love could calm that rage." Edward nodded, his eyes wet. "You didn't just save the children, Grace. You saved me too." Grace smiled faintly, her laughter light and sorrowful like an old melody. "No, Edward, it's the children who saved us both." In that moment, two souls who had lost everything sat facing each other in the dim golden light, not as employer and servant, but as kindred spirits who had finally learned that even pain can be a language of love. Outside, the snow fell thicker and heavier, but inside that quiet room, the small flame of understanding burned bright. The next morning, soft sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the Langford kitchen in a gentle golden hue. Grace was preparing breakfast. As usual, the four children came running inside, their laughter echoing through the house. Unbeknownst to anyone, Edward had spent the entire night awake, his mind consumed by Grace's story. When he finally descended the stairs, his eyes held a newfound depth, no longer reflecting the detached gaze of the master of the house, but rather the understanding of a man who had glimpsed profound truths. As the children gathered around the breakfast table, Edward spoke softly, his voice carrying a gentle weight. "Grace," he began, "I think it's time the boys learned a little about your past." Grace's eyes met his, hesitant and questioning. But as she saw the unwavering trust reflected in his gaze, she offered a subtle nod. She carefully placed her spoon on the table, wiped her hands on her apron, and settled down beside the four boys. Her voice was soft and tender, almost as if she feared shattering the fragile peace of the morning. "My dears," she began, "I once had 4 sons, just like you, mischievous, loud, and brimming with life. But they're in heaven now. I believe they're watching over children who still need to be loved." The kitchen was instantly enveloped in a heavy silence. Noah was the first to break it, his voice trembling with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Are you sad?" he asked. "Of course," Grace replied, a gentle smile gracing her lips, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But when we're sad and still choose to love, that sadness transforms into strength." Oliver stared at her for a long moment, his young mind trying to grasp the depth of her words. Ethan and Liam both lowered their heads, perhaps contemplating the immense loss she had endured. Then Noah, with the innocent boldness of youth, whispered, "So, if your sons are in heaven and we're down here, can you be our mum here?" The air seemed to freeze, hanging heavy with unspoken emotions. Grace looked down at the youngest boy, her heart aching at the vulnerability reflected in his innocent eyes. "A mother," she repeated softly, her voice filled with a gentle reverence. "I could never replace your mother, Emily." "Not replace," Noah interrupted gently, his voice laced with a child's simple logic. "Mom's in heaven, And you're here. We need both." Ethan reached out and took her hand, his touch tentative, yet filled with hope. "Can we call you Aunt Grace?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, the silence was absolute, broken only by the softest of breaths. Then a radiant smile spread across Grace's face, as warm and comforting as the first rays of sunlight. "If that's what you wish," she replied, her voice filled with genuine emotion, "I would be honored." The four boys immediately enveloped her in a warm embrace, their small arms wrapping tightly around her. Noah buried his face in her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for staying with us." 1 year later, spring returned to the Langford estate, bringing with it a sense of renewal and forgiveness. The Langford garden, once a silent testament to grief and loss, now bloomed vibrantly with the sounds of laughter and the radiant glow of light. Today was the memorial for Emily, the woman who remained the soul of the house even after she had departed this world. The four boys, now noticeably taller and more mature, wore crisp white shirts and held small photo albums that Grace had lovingly created for them. They stood together before a simple headstone engraved with the words, "Emily Langford, where love began." All 6 of them, Edward, Grace, and the 4 children, knelt together in the soft earth. There were no tears, only the delicate scent of flowers carried on the gentle breeze. Oliver spoke first, his voice steady and clear, filled with a quiet strength. "Mum, we know you can see us," Ethan continued, his eyes shining with a mixture of love and gratitude. "Thank you, Mum, for sending Aunt Grace to us," Liam added softly, his voice filled with reverence. "We haven't forgotten you, but we think you'd be happy knowing we're loved again." Noah placed his small hand on the headstone and whispered, "Mum, may I ask your permission to let Aunt Grace be our earthly mum?" The entire garden fell silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Then, from the grey sky above, a single, brilliant ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating all 6 of them in its golden embrace. No one spoke, but everyone understood. It was her answer. Edward turned to Grace, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, but his smile was gentle and filled with love. He knelt beside her in the garden and took her hand in his. "I don't want to replace what was lost," he said in a low, steady voice, his words filled with sincerity. "I just want to rebuild something new." From the ashes of their shared grief, Grace lowered her head, allowing tears of joy and gratitude to fall freely. But her lips curved into a soft, radiant smile. The 4 children instinctively wrapped their arms around them, creating a warm and loving circle where old pain began to melt away, making room for something miraculous and new to take root. A month later, a small, intimate wedding was held in the blooming garden. There was no extravagance, no grand gown, only family, close friends, and the many families who had been touched by the generosity of the Emily Langford Foundation. The boys ran around, their laughter echoing through the garden, playfully pinning flowers into Grace's hair, while Edward watched, his heart overflowing with love for the woman who had brought light back into his life. A year after that, amid more laughter and the sweet scent of blossoms, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Emily Grace Langford, uniting 2 generations, 2 souls, 2 stories into one beautiful tapestry of life and love. The garden was now affectionately known as the Garden of Joyful Memories. Roses planted by Oliver, lavender tended by Ethan, daisies carefully cultivated by Liam, and the small patch of wildflowers lovingly sown by Noah, all bloomed together in vibrant harmony. On the same fertile soil, Emily's flowers and Grace's flowers blossomed side by side, radiant under the life-giving sunlight, a poignant symbol of the past and present, living together as one. Edward and Grace sat together on a weathered wooden bench, their hands clasped tightly in one another's, watching the children play happily with their little sister. Sunlight gently touched their faces, not a blinding, overwhelming light, but the soft, comforting glow of a love that had bravely walked through darkness and found its way back to the light. Grace whispered, her voice as soft and gentle as the wind rustling through the trees. "From the darkest ashes," she said, "the brightest light is born." Edward smiled and replied, his voice filled with profound understanding, "Love doesn't die when we lose someone. It is reborn every time we dare to love again, even beyond the chaos and the pain." The sky stretched endlessly blue above them, the garden filled with the joyful sounds of children's laughter. And in that sound, perhaps Emily was smiling too, knowing that her love continued to bloom in the hearts of those she had left behind.